grateful that I'm able to welcome you as we gather here today. I wish to acknowledge this land in which we gather as Treaty 4 territory, the traditional lands of the Cree, Dakota, Nakota, Lakota, and Saulteaux nations, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. Regina Public Library and the Dunlop Gallery are committed to working together, reconciliation, and change. I'd like to welcome you in person, online live, or watching us later. However you're joining us, welcome. I'm a branch manager with Regina Public Library, and I'm filling in for Alyssa Fearon as she's on leave. Today, we're celebrating the opening of My Language Has No Word for Artist, curated by Brianna LaPlante. It is my true pleasure to welcome Brianna, Holly, Aubichon, and David Gardner to this opening reception and artist talk. The exhibition is curated by Brianna LaPlante as part of the Indigenous curatorial mentorship program. The program is a partnership with Sâkêwêwak, First Nations Artists Collective Incorporated. Holly Aubichon from Sâkêwêwak was instrumental in helping and mentoring Brianna. Brianna curated the show herself with help from Alyssa and Holly. This is the first curatorial mentorship project that the Dunlop has done, and we are planning to continue our efforts to nurture emerging curatorial practice in our province. Brianna, we're so honored and grateful to have you here at our Regina Public Library and at the Dunlop, and thanks for being here. And I'm going to turn it over to Holly Aubichon.
Hello everyone, Tonsei. Although Bark shared a little bit about the mentorship, I'll just share a little bit more before I introduce Bree and David officially. So we had gathered for, I think, 4 to 6 months only to do our mentorship, where we shared readings with each other that felt could have a conversation about what Indigenous curation looks like and how we can speak to our interests and needs also as an artist, which is Bree's first title. And so we had conversations around that and how to have conversations through art and through the visual culture. And that's something that Bree has paid a lot of attention to within the show and has been influenced in our conversations and from her own ideas. So I'd like to start off by introducing Bree. Brianna LaPlante is a fine artist from Fishing Lake First Nation. LaPlante's larger scale commissions have been sought out to elevate Treaty 4 spaces as an artist from the land. Artwork is an act of lifelong learning and resilience for her as an Anishinaabe, nehiyaw, Michif creator. Her work is rooted with the elevation of Indigenous knowledge systems, informed by the intersections of her life experiences. Underlying tones of her road to reclamation of both language and culture are present within all that she puts out into the world. The narrative is further explored through the multifaceted artworks, dialing in on the evolution of culture and the dualities of existing in both worlds of ceremony and urban life. Her artworks engage mind, body, and spirit. Please give us a round of applause to welcome Bree. This is the first curatorial opportunity outside of school, and so it's a different world outside of school, and it's been fun and challenging, and I've been grateful to be able to work alongside Bree. She's also, in the middle of this project, she applied for the programming coordinator position at Sâkêwêwak, so I'm also really happy to be working with her in that way too. And I'll introduce David, who's a professor in the past, also super excited to see us three up here. It's like a dream in some ways. So David Gardner is a Métis painter, curator, and critical art writer interested in creative expressions of Indigenous contemporary ways of being. He is the head of the visual arts department at the University of Regina, and Gardner recently curated Ganaseradage, the Contemporary Native Art Biennale in Montreal in 2020, with the assistance from Faye Mullen and Rudy Aker, and he also co-curated Transformer, Native Art in Light and Sound at the National Museum of the American Indian in New York City in 2017, with Kathleen Ash Milby. Gardner has given keynotes in Australia, New Zealand, the United States, and throughout Canada on issues such as misappropriation, reconciliation, public art, museum displays, and Indigenous contemporary art. His paintings are in numerous public and private collections, and David Gardner lives in Regina, Saskatchewan. So please also give David a welcome. So the process for today is going to have Bree asking a few questions with David, sharing both on the show and his work related to the show and likely as a larger theme as well. We have a bunch of paintings made by David Gardner as well running through here, just as he references. You might just want to see overall the collection and how his themes go across his work. And then I think likely at the end we can open up for open questions from the group. So if you have questions, hold it until we are able to have a section dedicated to that. And yeah, without further ado. Hello everybody, and thank you for coming to the Artist Talk featuring artist David Gardner from My Language Has No Word for Artist. This process of mentorship was a very valuable one to me where I got the opportunity to learn through readings, discussion, and being mentored by both Alyssa and Holly, people who are also I guess emerging curators. This task is no easy one for myself, as this is a whole new ballgame. Although related, I definitely found myself in different roles than I was used to, and it was like an uncomfortable, comfortable learning experience. And what I got to do was, sorry, excuse me. Is there water? Yeah, what I gained out of the learning process of the curatorial mentorship was getting a glimpse of the wonderful collection that Dunlop has to offer, and with this being led by an Indigenous person, my intent coming into this was to make it something meaningful and relevant to me and my art practice, as well as the larger Indigenous art collective here attached through Dunlop. And so with this opportunity, I really feel grateful and lucky to have David Gardner, as this is an opportunity to continue learning beyond the mentorship through what David will have to share in regards to his work, in regards to Indigenous contemporary art, and yeah, his relationship with some of the artists that I know and have had the honor to listen to his stories and make those connections in my own practice. But yeah, so if I may start asking questions, as an open-ended question, can you tell us a little bit about your art practice? And yeah, I just maybe start there.
Yeah, I want to start by saying what a pleasure it is to be here. I grew up in Edmonton, Alberta. I was born in 1962, and I haunted the library there. I would go into the kids section and then sneak up to the adult section. And then when I wasn't in the library, I was over at the Edmonton Art Gallery. And I always imagined myself as, you know, like a patron, somebody who's going there to borrow books, to see art and that kind of thing. And I never would have imagined that I'd be on the other side of the presentation thing. And even as a 61-year-old guy, I feel both honored and kind of embarrassed to be in this role, but it's a real pleasure. But I want to acknowledge that. And so when I moved to Regina here in '99 and saw that you have a library, not you, we have a library and a gallery in the same space, and you can go back and forth, and it's free, and there's all these other services, that's like a dream come true for a person who grew up with, you know, not a lot of money, not a lot of access otherwise. So this is a really important place, so I'm really honored to be here. And that's my art practice too. It began by going to the library, reading books, looking at the artists or looking at the work in the art galleries. I never went to the openings early on. I was didn't even probably know what that was. It's just too intimidating maybe. But always being around the edges and sort of absorbing things in. And I might be leaping ahead to a question here, but I love when you're talking about my relations or the people in the room there. One of the key parts of Indigenous curation that's maybe a little bit different from non-Indigenous curation is we're thinking about our relations. Not only the people who are in the room, people aren't in the room, but also being very deliberate. So you put my painting next to Bob Boyer. We're not related, we're both Métis, but when I moved here, he's the one that made this an easy process. Okay, no, he was a grumpy guy and he made it a hard process. He came into my office, you know, like the first week or two I was there, and he sits down and he says, Dave, I know you're Métis, I know your family history. Here, you know, or over there in Alberta, you can sit on the fence, but here you gotta be Métis or not. And that had stages, so I had no problem saying it was Métis. I had the genealogy, my dad was an amateur genealogist and had all that stuff, so that wasn't so hard. But then to take on the larger sense of what that meant, you know, making art about that idea or that history, and leaving behind all the possibilities of being a great Canadian artist or something, was really hard. That took about 2 years. And it were students, Lita Fontaine, who was here, and a few others that were encouraging. So those relations are really important. Then I see, you know, Keith Bird's in the room there, a former student of mine. Edward Patra, we share a relative together, Jim Brady, and I know Edward's made work on Jim Brady too. He would be both of our great uncles. They, we both descend from Laurent Garneau. So there's all that idea of relationship, and someone's always looking over your shoulder, but also you can go for support is a big part. And so seeing you guys working together, building up your chops in what can be a very intimidating field is really good to see. So I'm really honored that you chose me to be in that first show and continue that relationship.
Thank you. You're right. That is very connected to my next question. Speaking about Bob Boyer and your experience being taught by him, how has his influence affected your work, and are there elements in your work that come from his teachings?
Yeah, so he didn't teach me formally. I didn't take classes with him. I met him in Alberta. Okay, so I wanted to get to know him, and I was writing articles, and so when he was in town, maybe 5 years before I moved out here for the job, I told him I was interviewing him for a magazine, and I hadn't had anything lined up, no article was produced, but I just wanted to have a conversation with him. And when you're doing an interview like that, you know, you get to sit down with the artist for an hour and really pick his brains, and it was such a, he was so generous that I was, when the job came up here, I wanted to apply because I want to work near him, so that was a big deal. And then a really significant thing happened to me. He was part of the Royal Canadian Academy, and they had a show in Saskatoon maybe 2 years after I arrived, and it was mentors and mentees. And so, like I said, he hadn't trained me with painting or anything, but we'd have all these discussions, you know, every week or 2 weeks, prof stuff, art stuff, a lot of Métis stuff, all kinds of issues. And he would take me to powwows, and yeah, he was very generous, really made me welcome here in this territory, which I'd never really visited before. Anyways, when that show came up, he said, Dave, there's a show, and you're in it with me, and you're my mentee. Okay. So he was a mentor-mentee with that. But really it was to get into the culture here, and he told me about all sorts of things about being an Indigenous professor, the kind of expectations you would have, and hints of how you might navigate that. So that was significant to me, in a very important relationship. And it was a great loss that he left us so soon. But one of his parting gifts was he came to Sâkêwêwak. I was, I think it was chair or on the board at that time. And he came in and I thought, well, what's Bob doing here? Oh no, he's gonna give us shit, you know, like we've lost our way. He was so generous, he sat down, he listened, it was 2 days, and he gave us his input, his thoughts, and things that happened in the past, where we might think about going. It was really wonderful. Anyways, that's a memory of Bob.
No, thank you. I really appreciate you sharing that. And on that note of like just thinking about the past and the future. What I really wanted to do with this show is really honor artists as our trailblazers and our mentors, and really account for and be like continue that responsibility of maintaining, like in this context, plains, but plains are prairie ways of knowing and being. And so in the same way that you were able to be taught by Bob, I have the same opportunity through university and hopefully in the future to learn from you. And so I wanted to ask a little bit more questions about your work to share with the audience here. One thing that I noticed as I was putting together the show and also doing my research on the artists, you use rocks in your still lifes very frequently. And what do these rocks embody for you?
Yeah, so there's an ontology of rocks, both in Western thinking, in geology, and among Indigenous people, at least on the plains that I've talked to. And that's understanding that there's a being in these, in everything. There's a motion, a movement, there's a being, but there's different qualities of being. And so like a rock in the field that's just minding its own business, that is not bothering you and you're not bothering it, well, that's a rock. We call that a rock. But if you take it and you use it, then we call it a stone. A sini, it's a stone. And it means that it has its own being, but its being is innate. It has its own quality, which we may or may not know, but it's in relationship to us. And so if everyone walks along the beach and you pick up certain rocks and they become stones and you keep them and maybe you let them go, but while they're with you, they're in relation. And then there's a sense of, super stones and their grandfathers, and that they have knowledge. And I was listening to Catherine Boyer talk in Moose Jaw for her opening last night, and she was talking about the wood and batosh in this building, absorbing the sounds of the songs and witnessing the jigging. And I think we think of some stones like that. They have, like other prized possessions we have, like clothing, that seems to absorb a bit of us. So I think there's that kind of relation. But then there's also the quality that grandfather has, that it's its own, where we can learn from. Now that's getting on shaky territory, and I keep going back and forth on what that means. I was working on another project with a big bridge project I did in Edmonton. There's all these paintings on this bridge, and I was working with Jerry Saddleback, who is the elder, and the main elder that I talked with. I talked to all kinds of community people, but he was the guy, the go-to guy. And at one point he said, I was really stuck, okay, so there's 554 paintings, and I ran out of ideas at about 57, I'm just spinning my wheels. So I was asking him for help, and he said, well, go listen to the land, David. So I said, okay, I'll go listen to the land. And Laurent Garneau and Eleanor Garneau's river lot is right next to where the university is now, by the high-level bridge, if you've ever been to Edmonton. So I wandered that territory and tried to absorb, what might be there. And I actually had an epiphany. I had this vision. I fell asleep, okay, but I had a vision. And then I went back to Jerry Saddleback, it would have been a week or so later, and I told him what I saw, what ideas I had. And I said, I listened to the land, and he said, well, now that's really funny, David, because the land around here speaks Cree. And so I'm always worried about how much am I actually listening to something that's coming to me, and how much am I projecting, what I want to hear. And so there's that tension back and forth. And so I'm suspicious about whatever revelations I might get. And so when someone says, you're learning from the land, that may be true, but mostly you're learning from somebody who knows the land. An elder, knowledge keeper, Jerry. And just as when you're navigating the art world, the Indigenous art world, there's people before you that they're not your competition, right? We're here to help, we're here to listen, we're here to learn from. So there's that give and take, and you'll get some things that you want to hear, and other things that will resonate later that, okay, that might have been a truth that he was trying to sneak in there, and I wasn't ready for it that moment. That's how I learned. So the rocks have that similar relationship. So these rocks in the pieces. I have them in my studio. I have them in my home. I thought at first they would be just sort of props I'd use, but they really have become a relationship with me. And even when I'm not painting, I'm holding those rocks. And the paintings come up in a different way. So sometimes they really do come in a dream or a vision. Sometimes I'll take, a few days and I'm holding them and I have the books and the ideas come up. And then often a display will present itself to me, I'll paint it. But then what its meaning might be later on, I'll have the idea and give the title. So there's a rock there that's just a split rock with duct tape around it. And I didn't know why I wanted to do that. I wanted to sort of fix this rock, but I knew it was futile. And then I had been reading about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and I was remembering when I went to a lot of those events, how people were really hurting. And then I called that piece Healing Alone. That you can't heal alone. And when you do it, it's like putting duct tape over a wound. It's not gonna do it. And so for me, there's these deeper meanings that come that's more than that rock and more than me. It's somehow a combination, a dialogue. And so maybe the better pieces do that. They have this resonance that's beyond my intention. But I'm interested in this beingness of rocks and these qualities. When I was talking to elders like Sykes Powderface, who's recently passed, Stoney and Nakota in Alberta near Banff, and I was talking to him about this rocks. He says, oh yeah, there's this hierarchy. He wouldn't use that word, but there's this level. And it's mostly about visiting, So if you're going to a significant rock, you're visiting that rock and then it brings it alive. And that's how we make our relationship with territory or with other people, by visiting and learning. Anyways, I'm going on talking too much.
No, that's fabulous. I guess my next question would be in relation to the painting that is present in the curated show, and taking those ideas from how you view and your relationship with rocks. How does that relate back to Indigenous academia and your role? With the stack of the books and how you decided or made those decisions.
So I'm going to go about this roundabout way. When I had those early meetings with Bob, he was challenging me. He was never very direct, but challenging me to, because I was working in a Western realist tradition, he was sort of hinting, like by his examples of the blanket painting that's in there, for instance, of how you can tell a story without being so literal. And I was kind of literal in my painting. And then, so the first paintings I was doing are flags and Métis history. And then I was doing these dot paintings, and then realized Christy Belcourt's already doing that. But I was trying to bring beading to painting, to try and come up with a lot of Indigenous art is flat, like it's on the surface, like on teepee liners or on teepees or on stones. And so I was trying to bring that in. And I did a lot of that work, but I felt like I really want to address Western tradition. And so Western painting has a hierarchy according to the Academy, and history painting's at the top, and then there's portraits, and then landscape painting, and then like at the bottom is still life painting, right? Because it's thought to be really dumb. But when back in the day, so from the late 1600s to the 19th century, women, for instance, weren't allowed to go to the academy and learn how to paint from the figure. And so women weren't doing the top art. And so they would go and do the bottom art and do sneak in meanings. And I really like that stuff. And so I thought I'd take from an Indigenous point of view and sneak in my meanings. Also, almost all still life painting takes place within the home. And so that painting that's in there, I deliberately went out to try and do a still life painting that was artificial, stack of books, but in a natural setting. But it's an artificial setting. That's actually at First Nations University on a really big stone that's around the perimeter on the northwest corner that I would always visit. You go by a stone, you touch it. And so I thought I'd put the stack of books on there, and then it's looking south, and then I just, because as a painter you can remove all the buildings or whatever you don't want there. And so it was as if it's the open plains. And the stack shows at the very bottom
Good
representations.
afternoon. Welcome to Culture Days. We have board games happening on the mezzanine if you would like to come and play for us. All ages are welcome from 1:30 until 3. Thank you.
If you don't mind, I want to play some Django. No. So at the bottom are these misrepresentations of Indigenous people in books. And then as you move up, you get truer and truer insights. And so in the middle, there's sort of like history, and then there's sort of political things. And then the top is probably the most, I told you this was going to happen. I forget the most important people's names.
Maria Campbell.
Marie Campbell, thank you. Marie Campbell's book's at the top because when I first read that in the 80s, it shook me to the core because she was talking about literal places that I knew and grew up in and visited, the downtown core of Edmonton, for instance. And so she's always got to be at the top. And so when Judy Anderson does her beating, she does that book too because it had the similar kind of impact. And we have to acknowledge those people. I don't know if I fully answered your question.
I could ask I guess a related question.
Yeah.
Now, kind of taking a step back from like the literal rocks, the literal books, what considerations do you as an artist make when you're creating about the ways of knowing and being as an urban Indigenous person?
Yeah. So acknowledging that I'm part of a Western tradition, I'm bicultural that way. I'm raised and trained in Western tradition, and then how do I bring in Indigenous content? And for a while I was bringing in literal objects, like the Métis sash, not all, that's still always ongoing. Oh, actually, you asked your question about Indigenous in the Academy, and I can dovetail the two together.
Awesome.
So when you see a stone up there, it represents the grandfather. So sometimes it's trying to tell me something that has its own autonomy, and other times I'm trying to use it to tell something. And so it's the Indigenous presence. And then, in the most authentic way, and then there's book learning. And so most of the books are Indigenous authors, but sometimes they're not. And so when you're struggling within the academy, how much are you going to give credence to what you grew up with or what you learned from elders and what's in a book? Mm-hmm. And elders struggle with this too. I've talked to many elders and they want to share their knowledge. They want to have it in a book. They want it to be shared. But if it goes in the book, then what do we need an elder for? Is what people have said. So how do we engage people with, record them so that's not lost for all time, whether it's in a book or a videotape or whatever. But how do we not displace them? That's a real anxiety. So for instance, in the bridge project that I did with a team of like 12 other artists, I'm not writing down any of those stories that are recorded in or alluded to by the images. I take tours, and I'm actually working in the National Gallery, and they're working with the library in Edmonton, and we're going to build a group of Indigenous people, First Nations and Métis, who will then learn those stories and then tell them, walk people through. So it'll all be passed on orally. So I think there's this hope to record things so they don't get lost, but also to always embody the knowledge in people so that the objects that can be enacted through visiting. But I don't know what's up on the screen there, but some of them will show you like students or faculty being caught between a rock and a hard place, between a book and a rock. Which way do we go? There's one that's called Apple Press, so the student is being pressed or the faculty member is being pressed. Or sometimes one of the main things Bob told me is watch out for the shirk vultures, the profs who'll come in and get you on their shirk grant or whatever so they can get the funding but not really engage you. And then if they engage you and you start pushing back against their project, watch out and you'll see where their loyalties lie. And there were a lot of things, very practical things he told me that allowed me to negotiate a better space for myself when I came here. But the main anxiety you have when you're Métis, I'll just speak for myself, Métis in the academy is, am I myself? Am I representing my people? where does that begin and end? When am I an autonomous person? When am I a cultural person? And that's a constant negotiation. So maybe go on to the other question, because I went back to your first one.
No, that's okay. Like re-ask the last question or next
Oh,
question?
go whatever you want, yeah.
All right. I guess following what you're saying there, I'm really curious about, so I zoomed out from the literal meaning of the rocks in the books, and then to your role as a professor, as an artist, and as a a mentee, knowledge holder. Really, like you do hold stories, and you share those stories through your visuals. And so when we think about the plains as a whole, and we think about Métis people, and for your specific example, but for me, the Anishinaabe, nehiyaw, Michif, like what collective for you Métis, but what collective voice do you kind of witness emerging through your years of practice?
This is difficult. So Bob was more of a universalist. He was a much more spiritual person than me. And so he was looking for universal. Mm-hmm. And so then it allowed him to borrow from Assiniboine peoples or all the way down to Mexico. And he was sampling everything and trying to get to a more universal truth. And for me, that follows a modernist tradition, and not one that I can fully support, but I get it. When I put the rocks in there, it's a way of being humbled, in a sense of saying, yes, I'm representing you, but there's this other body of knowledge that I really don't fully know, but I know it's there. Like I was raised within a family where we studied Jung and a lot of the modernist thinkers, and so and I was raised Roman Catholic, so I get it, but I can't quite go there. Mm-hmm. I'm much more interested in the specifics. So how do people negotiate their own indigeneity, and what does that look like? Mm-hmm. That's why I look at contemporary art. And I'll tell you another story. So I did a painting here about Neil Stonechild, and it was based on his autopsy photo, and it was shown in the gallery here maybe 10 or 15 years ago. It was a long time ago. And there was all kinds of issues around it. But I felt like I had to bear witness to that situation. And some people, one professor, actually an Assiniboine person, prof, said that, you can't show that painting. And I agreed. I felt it was contentious. But I went to two elders that I barely knew, two women, and they both had the same story. And this had a profound impact on me. They said, okay, so artists aren't shaman, but they're like a shaman in the sense that they can be possessed by a knowledge or an energy or a vision that they don't fully understand, but they have to put out there. And that's why we have artists, to show us something that we don't quite know yet. Now, if you're not dealing with responsibly, you can be punished by this realm or the other. Okay, that's terrifying. And that painting, I'll tell you this story, I rarely share it, but that painting was in my studio, and I had to get a knowledge keeper come in to do a ceremony with it, because I've been in that studio now 24 years, and right in front of the painting, a mouse died. And it hasn't happened before, it hasn't happened since. Okay, I was a little freaked out. And then one day I was moving a crate, and the crate jerked out of my hands and went into that painting and ripped a hole into it that I repaired. So that's why I had to seek help, where it was something beyond me. And I'm a very materialist guy. I go to the scientific solution first, but then I know there's other possibilities like that. But what they were telling me, and Jerry Saddleback brought this up too, when I was doing these paintings for the bridge, I would bring them to him, I'd show them, sort of basically asking him permission. And at a certain point he says, Dave, you don't have to show us all these paintings. You're doing it in a good way. Well, that's terrifying too, because you have that responsibility when it might be going a wrong way. But what I've been getting so that's not my Métis community, that's mostly Plains, First Nations people. Mm-hmm. But what they're saying is, we need the artists to envision. We need curators to envision. So that's been my life missions, is to always double check, try it out, but not be afraid to put it out there and get feedback, punishment or praise to try and visualize. I'll tell one more story. So when I'm working on the bridge, originally there was going to be 100 paintings and they were going to be mostly Métis, and I go to the Métis Nation and we had a gathering and I said, I'm going to have 100 paintings and it's going to be all Métis, it's going to be incredible. And they said, no, you're not going to do that. And I said, no, I really am. No, there's somebody boss there that's going to tell you that you can't have, no, anything you want. And you tell me what to put on there. I really want to be at service to those people and their vision. So these ladies and a couple of men, they come in. I told them to do the research. They come in and they said, okay, this has to be a sash. Okay, yeah, sash, of course. Red River cart, this, that, the other. And so we had maybe 17 images, and I said, yeah, there's 100, what's next? And I showed them my slideshow. I already had those 17 and a few others they didn't think of. So for instance, Métis had teepees for a while. They said, no, they didn't. So I'd show a photo of a Métis family, recognized Métis family, with their teepee in the Red River cart. Yes, we did for a little while. And so then I said, well, more, you got to help me with more. And they were tapped out. The visuality for Métis people reached a certain limit, and then they didn't know. So that's part of my job, is to come up with a greater visuality. So you've got Leah Dorian in there, she's doing the same thing. Christy as well. So we're trying to increase the Métis presence and visuality too. That's part of our job. Sorry, I took it a different direction.
No, absolutely. You can answer the question however you like.
Yeah.
All of it is very valuable. So I guess I wanted to move on to one of my biggest, maybe stumpiest questions. In this process of my first time curating, what started to take form was this collective goal shared between the artists and including myself, was that we all want to elevate Indigenous knowledge. We all want to elevate, Indigenous fine art or craft, or however you define that. And so being a visual person, in my brain I saw the spider taking form of so here's the body, here's our common goal, whether it be for our own our own nation or nations in general. And each of us act as sort of this leg who we have to bounce off one another to be able to move this body forward. And when I was thinking about me as a leg, I was really stumped when I started doing my research, and I came across the use of plains versus prairie. And this is one of the biggest questions that when I got the chance to meet with David prior, this was also kind of a just a good question to ask. So I wanted to ask you, David, what was your thoughts on the use of the terminology plains versus prairie?
So as a writer, I think about words a lot. And so when I first heard the word reconciliation, for instance, because I was born a Catholic, and not just born a Catholic, so my aunt was a nun, head of her order. My uncle was a bishop, he's retired now, at Kamloops. And my mom went into the nuns and got kicked out, and then joined the army, and then got kicked out of that, and then became my mom. And she married a Jesuit priest. So Catholics, I've got the Catholic thing. And so I think about terminology a lot. When I heard reconciliation, that's a sacred rite in the Catholic Church. And it means that the sinner has to be reconciled with the church. And the church is the static, perfect thing, representation of heaven and God and all that stuff. And its emissaries on the world are the priests, and that you had to reconcile. You had to recognize that you were out of the Catholic body and you had to earn your way back in, basically through penance. Man. So when I saw that enacted at the TRC, it was very upsetting. So people had to basically make these public confessions or a written confession in order to get a payout. That's all very upsetting. So I think about words a lot. So I use the word conciliation, which means we're distinct people, we're coming together. When I think of the word sovereignty, I'm very careful. Sovereignty is a state-to-state relationship. When people are talking about being sovereign Indigenous nations, that's a political thing, right? They're talking about politics. When you're moving that into the cultural realm, you have to be very careful, right? Very careful about that. So I think the same thing with, and you brought it up and I thought about it afterwards, the plains and the prairie. Plains, we talk about the Great Plains, and that's a territory without border, right? It goes right across the parallel, it goes right across the provinces. It's a territory that's recognized as being, flat, a certain kind of grass. And so plains Indians, Plains Cree, that makes sense that people would adopt that rather than Prairie Indians and Prairie Cree. Prairies are the prairie provinces, so that seems to be more of a political division. I don't know how important that is, but it's interesting to think about.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
I like thinking about those words a lot.
I guess relating it back to my curatorial research and essay that will come is I really thought about land, and we discussed land as the importance of the language politics as an extension of land. We'll use the word territory. Territory, as David and I had discussed prior, is acknowledging like what's above, what's below, what's beyond, and so. We as Indigenous artists, as curators, as people, as knowledge holders, there will never be like, a determined way like on how to do this, how to do life, and in like these dual worlds we live in, especially as urban people. And I'm sorry to speak for those of you who are not urban and came from maybe another place or watching from another place. But I guess one of the for sure things that I know is there is no language that I know in the plains, as like wider North America, that Indigenous people use to describe artists. And so our roles, I'm finding, are very, and they have to be different. They have to take form in another way. We have to learn other ways with peer sharing. And when we're lucky enough, we have mentors like David, we have mentors like Bob Boyer. And so for me in this new position and learning like just like a new language, a new way of moving and being and knowing, this is this is like what came about that research. And have any of you or David know a word that an Indigenous artist has used to describe themselves in their language?
So if you go in the Montreal Museum of Fine Arts, I think that's where it is. They have a sign or a big wall thing out in front of the collection. I think that's where it is, where they came up with an Inuk word for artist. And I thought that was kind of good, but maybe not so good. So for me, the word art is a Western concept for sure. And it's so generous. Nobody in this room, none of my prof friends can define art, right? It's this really weird thing. And to me, that's a good thing. Because if you can't define it, you can't contain it. And it's always, if it gets contained, it slips out. Oh, art's beauty. Okay, look at this ugly shit here. It's no longer about beauty. It's got to be in the gallery. Oh, look at that performance out there. So it keeps shifting around because it doesn't want to be contained. A certain aspect of it. Another aspect of it wants to be totally settled. So for me, I divide Indigenous art or Native art into three kind of distinct categories. There's some rubbery space in between, but not really. So there's traditional art. And so when you're a traditional artist, you're making things based on templates and protocols from the community, and you're working with traditional materials. Now you can swap some of that out, right? New influences, it's not static. So if you're using quills and then you move to glass beads, it's still following enough of the tradition. If it goes too far outside of the tradition, you'll be called back in, or you'll be rejected and that's something else, okay? And those things are made by the community for the community, or for gifting and sharing, and sometimes for selling outside of the community. But all of its knowledge, all of its meanings are contained within the community. And so a proof of that is that no one from the art world ever writes a review or a critique of that work. it doesn't belong in that discourse community. It's its own thing. People can appreciate it. And then when settlers came, they brought the concept of art, and that means that you can separate something from its use, from its gift economy, from its tradition, and put it in a pedestal, in a gallery, or maybe on your home. But it now becomes a visual work, right? You're not supposed to touch it anymore. You're not supposed to wear it out. You're trying to preserve it. That's an entirely different mentality. That's the art mentality. Okay, so most Indigenous art is Aboriginal art, I call it, because it belongs to that Aboriginal era when Indigenous people who were Cree and Métis or whatever all became lumped in as becoming Aboriginal. And so they made Aboriginal art, and the test of that is it's for settlers. And so if you go to the West Coast, they made argillite pipes, and when the settlers wanted it, they made copies for them. But what's great about the Haida argillite pipes is that the ceremonial pipes, or the art pipes, have a hole drilled in the stem and in the bowl, but they don't meet, so you can't smoke it. So it's now a visual work of art and not something that you can use ceremonially. So art, from an Indigenous point of view, is always lesser than the real thing. It's a representation. Now, you can make Aboriginal art, and through this concept of visiting and doing what we're doing now, we can bring it to life and make it back to a more traditional sense and still be in a contemporary mode. But if you're making art primarily for settler artists or the settler art economy, so art galleries that are not run by an Indigenous curator or a board or whatever, and it's being reviewed by mostly non-Indigenous people, then that's Aboriginal art. And then the final third category that I hope to participate in is the Indigenous art world, which has Indigenous curators, has Indigenous writers, has Indigenous audiences bringing it to life. And you behave very differently with that work. So that idea of these relationships, these visiting, it's done in non-Indigenous communities as well, but not to the same degree, right? As an Indigenous curator, when I was doing non-Indigenous shows, you would never show a relative, you would never show your partner, you would never show your friends, right? That would be against the rules. And for instance, when I did Gavatira Daje, I had 20 artists, senior artists, and then I got them to invite relatives. So they were mostly beaters, and so, Sherry would get, I think, brought in her daughter and mentee, or someone would bring mentors. And so that's a very different way of seeing the world. So if you're working in Indigenous mode, you're using traditional methodologies, but within a contemporary art world. These are three very distinct things. So in the first one, it's a non-critical mode, or the criticism exists only within the community. The Aboriginal mode means that it's a free-for-all, you're part of the art market generally, but you're doing Indigenous. But the third one, the only criticism that really counts is from Indigenous people, Indigenous curators, and those other wise non-Indigenous people, especially we're having more alliances with African Canadians and diasporic communities, and also internationally. Part of the Indigenous is about international relations. So I have a lot of relationships and do shows in Australia. Anyway, sorry to go on about that big thing, but it's important to know the difference. And for instance, I'm working with CARFAC and Indigenous copyright. Well, if you have copyright within community and clan system and knowledge, that's one. And then if you're showing within the free market, that's another. And if you're trying to follow these other ethics, that's a third. And often the conflicts come when Indigenous artists are breaking protocol. Not just white carpetbaggers, but Indigenous people not recognizing when they're making a violation. Anyways, I know I went off topic. I also wanted to share a thought about territory I think I shared with you earlier, because I was at Ganasatake, it's only been a month ago, and the elder there told me this hilarious story. He said that they have this ceremony, and the ceremony has to do with the Pleiades stars overhead. And at a certain time of year, they do the ceremony of the Pleiades stars. And when he was a young man, he said to his elders, but the Pleiades stars are not overhead, they're over this way. And they said, well, yeah, but that's because we used to come from basically what is like Colombia, right? And they said, and he went to Colombia, and the Pleiades was right above, and they said, holy mackerel. So when you talk about territory, which territory? Of course we want to fetishize our sacred sites here, but we always know we're from elsewhere, and not just elsewhere there, but elsewhere there. So what's the territory? And so I like to think specifically for the Métis, so I wrote a paper called Migration is Territory. And the idea of visiting is territory. It's our relations that create territory, not ownership. Anyways.
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting topic to me, just like in reflection of my own connections to land and rights to such land, and what makes me Indigenous beyond the things that I have not yet experienced as an urban Indigenous person. And so when I was doing some research, I just have a couple more questions. But I really wanted to share, I guess, a quote that was really bothering me and really making me think hard and critically about the visual language. And so I'll share a quote with you from Pierre Trudeau.
That was a surprise.
Yeah. Don't worry, I'll get to it. But if you no longer speak your language and no longer practice your culture, then you have no right to demand Aboriginal rights from us because you are assimilated with the ruling power. Now, with that comes a lot of layers that I still have yet to unpack, but the one that I know for sure is my connection as an artist to the visual language, where I do not have, or I do not carry my three languages, which would be Sâkêwêwak, nehiyaw, and Michif. And so, as a visual artist, but also a writer, how does the visual language and academics kind of step in as a way to voice what language can't?
I got to go back to the Pierre Elliott Trudeau quote, because I sort of agree and disagree, and there's too much to unpack there, but I want to bring up a few things. So there's a philosopher by the name of Wittgenstein, and I've used him a lot to try and understand when you say, what's the definition of art, and so some things are included in one definition and others the other. What's the definition of a good Métis person or a Métis person? There's always things that fall in and out.
Mm-hmm.
And so you have to have, for the Métis, three very limited things, right? You have to say you're Métis, you have to have the Métis heritage and blood that's proven, and a relationship to a Métis community, and hopefully they claim you. Well, that's pretty friggin' minimal standards, right? So now people are starting to talk about what's a good Métis, right?
Mm.
So there's quality of beings, and I was talking about the hierarchy of beings. So yeah, if I spoke Michif, I'd be a better Métis. Not just because I'd have that rubber stamp and that little extra check mark, but I will also have acknowledged that, my ancestors spoke Michif, and they spoke nehiyaw, and they spoke, actually Lawrence spoke, I think, 6 languages. And why am I only speaking English now?
Mm-hmm.
Right? That's a colonial thing that my ancestors said, yeah, in order to get along, you got to erase these things. So what's happening with Indigenous people as opposed to Aboriginal people is Indigenous people are learning their language. So about 13 or 14 years ago, I went to New Zealand with a group of curators, and I'm trying to remember who was all there. And we went to this museum, Te Paupau. And at the certain point, the non-Indigenous and the Maori people all sang a song and then said, oh, sing your song. And we all looked around each other, not one of us, and we were brought by the Indigenous Curatorial Collective and Canada Council. We were all sent there, and not one of us knew our language.
Mm.
And that's multiple. It means that they chose people who didn't speak their language, wittingly or not, but also the people who could get to that position of being Indigenous curator had to not learn their language, spend their time learning the language, doing other things, in order to do this thing to signify within the dominant culture. And we were embarrassed. We were embarrassed. And they said, oh, no, sing anything, like happy birthday or something. We weren't going to humiliate ourselves. But after that, so Kathy Mattis was in that group, and she went back and she's learning Michif. Tanya Willard was on that group, and she's learning her language. I can't remember, she's Interior BC, I forgot what her nation is. Almost everybody came back, except more on me, to learn their language. Because I realized in order to be an Indigenous person, to signify as an Indigenous person around the world, they had to do that. All the best scholars, Dylan Robinson is learning Stolo. Like, here's a guy with a PhD and this big track, but in the summers he humbles himself, he goes back to his Stolo community, well now he's living there, Stolo community, and learns his language. Each one of us is only good enough to get to this position we're at, and then we're outclassed by the next generation, like you two, and you come in with your specific knowledge, but language should be there. So Trudeau's right. In order to be the next better generation, you've got to do that. Look at all the people learning how to bead. What a humbling thing. You know, you're going to be this great painter and video artist or a filmmaker, and then you're in a beading circle. And you're going to sit with people who are not talking highfalutin stuff. That's the best of the best, right? And that's why Sherry Farrow-Set and others, or the Daphne Collective, have weekly beading circles to keep that other body of knowledge and not just go for the highest thing. And that's the best of the Indigenous, is at the high and at the low, always moving back and forth. Which probably didn't answer any of your questions. That was important.
Yeah, no, I guess I just wanted to really emphasize that, because it is evident that, like, you know, we're going nowhere. I think a lot of, like, the visual language and all the work here that you see.
Oh yeah, sorry, let me answer that question.
Okay, yeah, of course.
The answer is to do everything. There's enough of us now. When early days were on, you look at Gerald, oh, now I've forgotten Gerald's last name, curator. Or McMaster and others. When we were talking early on, we felt like we had to do everything. You had to be an artist, you had to be a curator, you had to be a writer, you had to do all this stuff. And almost all that first generation did all those things. So Bob curated as well, didn't write much, and now I feel like people can specialize, but you have to be cautious. There are elders that caution about specialization and that professional deformation that can happen. So building these visual vocabularies and the language, you know, an Indigenous language and protocols is really important. Okay, sorry, get to your question.
I guess I just wanted to, just as somebody who's, like, humble enough to admit, like, I don't have my language, I'm practicing and I'm reclaiming and doing that work. Although with language, I guess something that is very evident to, you know, that we do and have and maintain these rights as Indigenous people is our visual language. Is when you step into that room, you enter, you have to pass by the names of all of our, like our First Nations, Indigenous, you know, Métis, of like of North America, and in that sense, like, it's like an invitation of me saying to you guys, like, all my relations. And then when you step inside, you see all my relations in the beautiful, like, color, like, you know, symbology. You see, so, like, you see families, you see ceremony, you see belief, and you see life. And so with visual culture, I guess my question being kind of confusing, how has that stepped in to provide a voice for an artist such as yourself?
So one of the last things I got from Bob is he was really giddy. One day he came into my studio, or yeah, I think we were in my studio, and he talked about these new paintings he was putting together. And they had left the abstraction and the blankets, and they were more figurative and like angels and stuff, and he had just started this new thing, and he was just really happy. And I asked him about that. You know, actually we were talking about Edward Poitras' work too, I think, and about conceptual art, or that, and he says, well, the people he knows who are not artists, they like beauty. And the first thing I like going into that room is, you know, you got Edward, who dreads color, right? He's a conceptual artist, so conceptual artists, they have a lot of fear about color and emotion. And then you go through that, and then there's all this color, and that's what unites it together. And I don't have a dread of color, but I worry about not being as eloquent as some. And so I slowly brought it in, and to see other people with such confidence, it's just, wah! And especially textiles artists, just like put it all out there. I just love that, and so I love that you've brought in the heart and the mind in that space, but it's color that announces us, you know, that we're not shrinking away and we're taking up space. And I think you were commenting about this room is so much smaller than I thought it was, you know, when you're planning, and then suddenly all this comes in. I remember the curator, Amanda Kasher, when she was director curator here, she'd always just fill stuff in because she had so much to say. And right now we've got so much. Oh, I want to go back to a point. You talked about Indigenous knowledge. So yes, there's Indigenous knowledge. It's sitting there, you can go and tap it, you can read it in a book if you must, you can get it from an elder knowledge keeper, but we're also producing knowledge, and we can't shy away from that. The idea is we're not just transmitters, we're actually producing. So the artist's role is, from a traditional point of view, is to reproduce, okay? But as we move to Indigenous, we're also in a production mode. We're making things, and they have to be tested by a public to say whether that's true or not. It's very different mode than the traditional mode.
I guess as like a kind of a last comment, I really I made this connection between like I as like looking at the artworks and those artworks and their agency, I realized that in creating these artworks, these artists have not only told stories, and you know, if you understand, you understand, but on the other hand, they have also protected like those sacred stories, those sacred meanings, those deeper lifelong learning lessons. And in that same way, we have our knowledge holders, our old ones, telling stories in ways that we as the people, as you know, the knowledge producers, as the people to kind of reiterate or understand. Old ones tell stories in that same way, where they'll tell you something, like they'll tell you a story in connection to what they're trying to tell you, and if you understand that, you know, that's great. Then you have enough like pre-knowledge, I guess. And if you don't, then you must like the story you told with I forget if it was the guy from Edmonton or if it was from Bob Boyer, but yeah, Jerry Saddleback, and just how you had to come back to that thought and just re-understand it. And yeah, I guess like with that being said, this curated show is really a celebration of those voices, of that knowledge, of you know, that learning and that continuous lifelong learning that, you know, we all have to do, that we're responsible for. And yeah, I guess just being like urban Indigenous, what does treaty, you know, being on this land mean? What does being from the plains mean? What does prairie mean? I'm asking all of these questions because I'm just figuring that out for myself. These are all things that I'm gonna continue asking myself, and you know, maybe in my lifetime I'll come to a solid, concrete answer, although, you know, I ask questions and David's still asking questions too, so.
Oh yeah, well I hope you don't come to solid answers.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing is, these little contingent things we leave behind called artworks or shows, that's a path that other people can pick up, make their own meanings with, find comfort, find some pathway. I think that's the key. I call it respectful try. You know, it's not perfect. We're doing our best. And humbleness helps there for sure, but also confidence, you know, building that you have some knowledge. Did we want to open it up? I can't believe people are patient listening to that for so long. They locked the door, that's what it was. Keep everybody in.
Yeah, anyone have questions?
Hi.
So you talked about the three categories of art, traditional, Aboriginal, Indigenous.
Yeah.
Do you categorize yourself in any of those three or all three?
Yeah, so not traditional. So what I've noticed with truly traditional people, they're not happy about being called artists often. And sometimes it's humility, but sometimes, like, don't insult me. That's like talking to an elder and saying, well, you're a professor. Well, no, don't insult me. Maybe I'm like a professor, if that makes it easier for you to understand what I'm doing, right? But I've seen people like cold reject that notion of art because they don't want to be part of that whole art world network judgy thing, because that's not what they're doing. So I'm not part of that. So I tried beading. I made a jacket and I've done some other things. And so I really respect that, and I will make more. And it's its own thing. And I bring in concepts that express me, but I'm humbled by what that medium can do, which is limited in some ways, but limited in a joyful way, and it's also understandable by other people right away. That took a long time, or you are not a type beater, or whatever information's passed on. Aboriginal artist, to the degree that I felt like I've been trying to find my way into the institutions, and it's been important for me to have my work in the art gallery. I do honor the Western traditions. There's a lot of knowledge and value in there, but the content has been disrespectful or inappropriate, and so I want to bring in content otherwise. The Indigenous refers to a network of Indigenous curators, artists around the world, and also beyond Métis, so that I have a mission for Métis people, but I have a mission that goes beyond that, that is more like research creation and trying to understand. So more on those two categories. But I've always felt more on the Indigenous side in the sense that a lot of what I do is critical writing and chapters in books and talks and that sort of thing, to try and have people understand, help provide maps so they can see things. Like just those three categories, when I brought those up for copyright, they realized, oh yeah, there's 3 sets of rules. So national copyright, regular copyright, legal copyright, well that covers Aboriginal art if you're ripping somebody off. But if you're in the traditional and you're making something and you're breaking a protocol within a family or a clan, that follows a different order, right? You don't bring in the cops for that. It's a family matter. On the Indigenous, it's so weird, and what is going on? We have to develop our own rules and protocols that are echoing the traditional, but they're not confined and held by that. Similarly, our identities and the way we live our lives, especially in an urban setting, isn't going to be the same in a traditional community. We couldn't live that way. So I aspire to the Indigenous. And the Indigenous is an aspirational identity. It's not one that we dig up from the earth and try and live that way. It's always compromised by the colonial system that we're in and find sites of resistance or sovereignty.
So if I could ask a second part to that question. In a lot of the contemporary shows, we see some traditional pieces included.
Yeah.
But then the label is applied, like say, grandmother artist.
Yeah.
So that is like a projection of the label artist, and I was wondering if you have any thoughts around that.
Yeah, again, I have a hard time because what happens is that's a curatorial Indigenous intervention applying a category to the past that the person would never have recognized themselves. But when you make something, that object has an agency that goes beyond the intention. And if a subsequent future generation sees that value and wants to elevate it and put it in that discourse, give it a try. Sometimes it doesn't work. Some curators will willy-nilly bring traditional things back in and they don't match. Brenda Croft is an Australian, very important curator, and about 14 years ago I was at an exhibition. She did that. It was called Culture Warriors, and she brought traditional work in and contemporary work, brought them all together. Okay, there were formal ways that they fit together, like color or pattern or whatever. Great, got that. But then when the human beings were brought in, they did not get along because their projects were distinct, right? The traditional person says, what are you doing here? You're just bastardizing our culture. You're a horror show. And the other one says, you're not making art. You know, the categories are different. That's why this is a useful thing, to realize, yeah, your intentions are different. Years ago, I brought together, when I used to teach in Calgary, traditional ceramists and conceptual potters together. And, Greg Pace said, okay, that's good, but we don't get along. And in the morning, it was great because we talked about craft, we talked about skills, we talked about exhibitions. Then we started talking about conceptual things, they just separated, some of them just laughed, So there's these categories are useful, but a great curator can bridge those gaps. And that's why those cards are important to explain why you're rehabilitating, why you're bringing them in. But just to call something art, you go to the subway and there's some subway artists, sandwich artists. It's a way in our culture we just say to elevate something. But when it has a deeper meaning, we have to negotiate that meaning, explain why would you do that, you know? Anyways, but it's primarily a colonial activity, you know, like colonists would go to Africa, bring in the Trocadero Museum in Paris in the early part of the last century, they'd bring in and say, well, this is now art. But the people who made it never thought it that way. And so then it becomes isolated, not put in relationship, it's something to be looked at visually, not to be touched, not to be destroyed and remade. So we have to watch out for what that category can do to our work.
We've got a question from online. This is for Bree. What is something that resonates with you from the mentorship process?
Oh man, let me reflect for just 2 seconds. One thing that really stands out in the process of being mentored or through this new and ambitious project and partnership made between Sâkêwêwak and Dunlop Art Gallery is there is no clear way on how to do Indigenous curating work. There's no clear way because of the lack of Indigenous curated shows and Indigenous curation as a practice. There's students still disseminating this information, and me as a student also disseminating this information for myself. And in the introductory process, I think a lot about what David was mentioning about visiting is that's definitely the number one thing that has to happen. That's the number one thing that I had the opportunity to have with Holly is the peer sharing, the soundboarding, the offering to help with edits, and the offering to help with the uneasy feelings that comes with deciding, well, how do I make this Indigenous as a big question, right? And that I still have that question, and I think it'll take at least a couple more shows to decide, but how do I make curation Indigenous, or how do I do it in an Indigenous way, or the Anishinaabe, nehiyaw, Michif way? And so I think that's my biggest question to your question is that's definitely the biggest thing that sticks out to me, and the answer that I still have yet to find.
One thing that I would add is that there's a growth of Indigenous curation where Indigenous curators are supported but have autonomy. Mm-hmm. But there are also an amazing amount, almost all women, curators doing their PhDs. So Kathy Mattis's PhD thesis, or Erin Sutherland's thesis, she's mentee out of University of Calgary. There's all this new knowledge being produced that you can go read about Indigenous curation. And they're, as you say, feeling their way through, but there are certain principles that do arise, and it's around, I call it critical care, mm-hmm. which is being human, being a real human being and taking care of the objects as beings, and of the artists who produce them, but also the communities that are receiving them. Mm-hmm. Noticing that it's not just a focus on objects, but on relations, not just humans, but on relations. There's quite a few things that are general. They're not rules yet, but they're protocols. They're things we're finding, we're trying out, and they tend to be successful. So it's but it's only by sharing that we find out what other people are doing. So but there's knowledge being produced. But you could go back 10 and 20 years ago when there wasn't anything there. Individual people were trying their own thing. So, man, you guys are patient. This is crazy.
Good room. Back here.
This time, I don't want to make people. My question is for David. You said that if an elder writes a book or tell the stories that are recorded, so those knowledge are reserved somewhere, so why we need an elder for? And it's brought a thought to my head that do we need an elder just for the knowledge, or it reminds me of the future problem probably we have like with the AI and professions, because AI access to all the humans' knowledge. But for example, if an AI like software has every knowledge about human body and stuff, we still need doctors and physicians, because it doesn't, you know, the moment we need some analysis for the moment, AI cannot do that, but a human need to be there so it can compatible those knowledge with that current situation. And I was thinking probably, even if that knowledge reserved somewhere, an elder can still be useful, because the new thing happened in a community and like to compatible with the situation of indigenous people and the modern problems. With the wisdom of that elder, probably it's still helpful. It's not like that if those, because I mean saving, reserving can correct some human errors, because for example in religion texts that they pass, they obviously change because people memory human like malfunction of memory, but in that way you have the original thing forever for everybody, but also elders can be the guide to those knowledge.
Sounds like you answered your own question.
I mean, is it offensive? Is it offensive thought for
So,
indigenous people,
I'll-
or like
I'll-
why they don't like it?
I'll set it in the context of what I was saying earlier. So the museum enlightenment model of taking the best things from every culture to make the encyclopedic museum, you take the best things from every culture and you put it in there to preserve for all of humanity, right? That's a modernist, really pre-modernist, but enlightenment type project. But what that does is then it's a preservation model, okay? The indigenous model is, so let's say you make, you're on the West Coast, you make a totem pole, it's meant to decay. And then if it's valued, then you'll make another one. And in order to make that other one, you have to have a body of knowledge embodied in human beings to make that other object. I like the idea of the drum, like a hand drum. You know, hand drums don't last forever. And so you have a hand drum that's based on a previous drum, that's based on a previous drum going back to who knows when. And then you know that that hand drum is going to go and make another hand drum all the way into the future. But with every hand drum, there's the maker who has the knowledge. They learn from somebody else that way, and they're going to pass it that way. If you take the hand drum or the totem pole and you put it and make it a preserve, then you disrupt that whole chain of being going into the past and the future. And that's what the colonist mentality wants to do, is to stop the thing, stop the culture, preserve it for their own ends, okay? So preserving the knowledge of in a book and all that, it's all good. But first of all, it's in translation, usually. So when I went with Jerry Saddleback, so I was in, I don't know what to call it, this learning thing for 4 days and 4 nights in a Quonset hut with a few other people on his reserve. And I got all this knowledge. He kept reminding this, you know, I'm telling you in English, you're not really getting the real thing. If I told you in Cree, you'd really get it. And if we did the whole thing, it would take a month. So like, this is a watered down version. In the meantime, my eyes are bugging out of my head. I'm sweating. I'm thinking about my whole life in a different way. And if I had gotten the whole thing, I would have been overwhelmed. But then I would have been part of the real culture. I'm just getting a glimpse. AI, all these things, books, they're representations, right? Right? The real thing is gone. But there are a lot of elders. I remember being in, I forgot where it was, in Vancouver at the Belkin Art Center, and an elder there was just in tears. He was really worried about the rising sea level, and so he was passing on a story to this group of us of secret and sacred knowledge. But he felt that he had to pass it on. There's been a disruption with Indian residential schools. The disruption, it sounds like, oh, some kids were harmed or so on. No, it was a disruption of the entire culture. It's unbelievable. I keep seeing all these fissures and traces of it, so that the elders are humbling themselves or whatever and having themselves recorded because they're not able to pass it on to a young person who, in addition to learn how to be a human being in this complex world, also has to learn the complex world of the Indigenous. Only a few people can really do both those things. And so that intergenerational knowledge has been severed in such a significant way. So you might have successful Indigenous people, but they're less Cree, they're less Métis than they should be at this point. Anyway, sorry, now I'm getting all upset. But to me, this way of thinking is of a whole. It's not just a small thing, every part is related. So when we're talking about Indigenous curation, it has to understand those disruptions. But also has to understand there's a lot of Indigenous people there who just want to make some art and make some money. And they're part of this horrible collective colonized Aboriginal art system. And how do we win them over to the traditional or into the Indigenous and not just making things for the settler majority? That's really hard. That is existential. Anyway, sorry.
Ending off on that.
You can tell I can talk on and on.
Ending off on that existential thought. Is there any other questions in the audience or on the forum? All right. Well, I think it's safe to call it. I do want to invite you guys to come and check out the show if you haven't already. In that room, I just really wanted to emphasize like the celebration, the resistance, and especially the honoring of these artists who have made artwork for the Dunlop permanent collection. And yeah, I just want to also just send like a friendly invite to continue asking questions with me. I might have an answer, it might not be the answer, but I really want to continue asking questions. I feel this is a really great opportunity to enforce like that need to share, that need to converse and be with one another. So yeah, if you want to know more, come on over. Although for those of you who have to get going, I'm really, really grateful that you could be here today, whether in person or virtual. And yes, thank you for listening to our Artist in Conversation.